Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of the NatCon Australia podcast. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Isaac Stone-Fish. Isaac is the founder and CEO of Strategy Risks, a business intelligence firm focusing on geopolitical risk. He is the former Beijing correspondent for Newsweek and worked in China for many years. Among his many roles, he serves as a contributor to CBS News, is an adjunct at NYC's Center for Global Affairs, and has positions on the Atlantic Council and the Council for Foreign Relations. He's the author of America's Second, How America's Elites Are Making China Stronger. And he is based in New York City, but it's coming to us from Washington, D.C. Have we all got that right, Isaac?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you. And thanks for having me here.
No sweat. It's a topic I have to ask straight off the bat because it's just around the corner. The US presidential election. How will that result impact on China-US relations? What will it look like if Kamala wins? What will it look like if Trump wins?
First off, and I think this will be true probably until the morning of the election, it's a total toss-up. So there's three scenarios we're looking at. One is Harris wins, the other is Trump wins, and then the third and the scariest is Harris wins and Trump says he wins. And if Harris wins, that's frankly a likely outcome there. And that would be the most destabilizing for US-China relations, because it would be, perhaps in Beijing's mind, a great opportunity to exploit the perception of chaos in DC. And that's where there's an outsized chance of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan or a blockade or another very provocative move from Beijing. If we have a peaceful transfer of power, which one certainly hopes, and it's crazy that we have to talk about this like it might actually happen, the destabilizing factor. But if we do have a peaceful transfer, I think under Harris, people should understand that she is more hawkish than is to be expected from someone of her background and from someone, of the sort of California political scene that she's been in. I think Trump in office, it depends on how much control and how forceful he is. The more that he puts his imprint on policy, the less hawkish the administration will be. And the more that he delegates, or the more that he's not present, either because he's distracted or because of any potential mental disintegration that he might have or might face in the future, the administration will be broadly more hawkish.
Has she said anything substantial on China in the lead up to the presidential election? A keynote policy speech which mentions China stuff and how our approach will be different. That hasn't gone down.
Nothing substantial, and it feels like something where the base case is she follows along with what Biden has been doing. We have a much better sense of who Trump's China advisors, but also who his cabinet secretaries may be. And we have a much worse sense of that with Harris, because this is such an accelerated campaign for the American race. So we think that she will be that way in part because that's the best information we have, but she could very much surprise us and be far more conciliatory or far more aggressive than we're expecting.
Yeah, well, it's kind of amazing that it's so unknown from her perspective. He has said lots of things on China. And as you mentioned, we have a bit better of an idea about who his cabinet advisors will be on China. One would expect, Robert Lighthizer, the former US trade representative, will take up that role again. Who else? I mean, you can correct me if I'm wrong. Who else is likely to be in his close circle advising him on China matters if he gets across the line?
Lighthizer is certainly a popular choice to run the USTR, but it's not confirmed, and there will be surprises with his cabinet. I think, though, Lighthizer is the most likely to replay the same role that he played from a cabinet perspective. We do expect Peter Navarro, Trump's bombastic China advisor, to play some role. It's possible that Pottinger, the deputy national security advisor, returns in some role as well. And I think the big one that we're watching from a China policy perspective is Treasury, because the two front runners have radically different policies on China. You have Jeff Yas, who's a billionaire investor and holds a substantial stake in TikTok. And so one doesn't have to scratch real hard to understand where he is on China. And then you have John Paulson, a billionaire investor, who is more hawkish, arguably considerably more hawkish on China than Yas is. And so state, commerce, defense are all traditionally tougher on China than Treasury is. And so we expect to see more movement, more distance from Treasury. And so if Trump appoints someone there who is more hawkish, that would then be a pretty strong signal.
Well, neither of those guys, Yas or Paulson, have previously served in public office, have they, or not?
And I don't think so. I'm not fully sure of their backgrounds. I'm pretty sure neither of them have. And it's not too out of the ordinary for cabinet secretaries to not have any government background. You know, that there's the thinking, and it didn't work with Rex Tillerson. It was Trump's first Secretary of State. But if they can run big, complex organizations, or if they're successful investors, they should be successful in the government. But it's a different series of skills. But I do think we will probably get someone in Treasury who's not a DC creature and doesn't have experience or has very limited experience in government.
I read, and I'm a lawyer, so I pay attention to these things, that if you get appointed to these roles, you're allowed to sell off your share portfolio without being hit with capital gains tax. So it's a nice little way out, a tax loophole, amongst other things. On Harris, put that aside, it makes me skeptical from the go-get. But why is Treasury typically more soft on China, in your view?
Because of the links between the Treasury Department and the U.S. financial community. And even commerce didn't have the perception, and I'd argue that in this case, the perception is reality, but didn't have the perception or the connection to U.S. business and U.S. business interests that Treasury did and does. And so that's generally been seen as the most dovish or the most conciliatory, or depending on what side of the debate you're on, the most reasonable arm of the U.S. government as it comes to China. So it's been the standard of the last, I want to say 3 or 4 administrations. That's been the role that Treasury's played. And you hear a lot of grumbling from folks in state or commerce or DOD about, hey, we wanted to get this done, but folks at Treasury.
Yeah, right. And again, we don't have any real idea who Harris will staff her administration with, that might have her ear when it comes to China policy.
I've heard names being floated, but it really just feels like people are guessing right now, and we don't know. I think, a senator or a congressperson who is very instrumental in her getting this role, I think some of them will get rewarded, and their China policies will certainly be important on the department that they run. But besides, occasional, there's a story in the FT about, a longtime advisor, but no, there's really not that much that to me has seemed comprehensive or credible.
Yeah, right. It's just amazing, such a black box when it comes to such a important relationship that we have. I mean, from here, we had the Australian Treasurer who just returned from Beijing, heralding stabilization in the relationship, which is the new buzzword that they're using, and stressing the need for engagement, not estrangement, which is, I'm sure it makes your eyes roll. It makes my eyes roll. But what's wrong with that approach? What's wrong with greater mutual understanding? What's wrong with engagement as a general approach to China?
The problem isn't with the ideas, it's with the terms. And we use these terms at our peril because we think they mean one thing and Beijing thinks they mean something else. And so the example that I'll often quote, people will say China has 5,000 years of history. And what's wrong with saying that? And the problem with saying that is that that's a party term that's meant to link the Communist Party, which took over in 1949, to the rest of Chinese history and make it seem inevitable. And it's a propaganda slogan. And we can't pretend that terms like engagement and misunderstanding and people-to-people exchanges aren't party slogans. And I think back, as a Jew, I think back to the idea of, hey, someone wants to be a socialist, great. Someone wants to be a socialist on a national level, great. If you say you're a national socialist, that's what Nazi is, and that's what that word means. And so you can't just say, oh, I'm a national socialist, and expect it not to have these deep historical resonance. And so you can't say China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, for example, and not be repeating a Communist Party slogan. It's what the words mean in the context, not what they mean if they were divorced of reality. And so I think when people say, I want to have more engagement with China, what they mean is, I want to be talking and communicating more with Chinese people. But what they are saying is, I want the party to send forth party faithful in curated meetings that I'm having with folks who don't understand how they're working with the Communist Party.
Yeah, I mean, you're a fan, like I am, of the journalist James Mann, who wrote that book, The China Fantasy. I always throw it in front of people who talk like chambers of commerce types about the relationship and have no real idea, just as a way of getting them thinking. Because amongst other things, he's almost like a great English teacher, analyzing words, what they mean, and putting them in context. And there needs to be a lot more of that. But it's almost as though I think the word engagement in particular should be banned, because if you ban that word, it makes people reach for other ideas about how to describe the relationship and really gets them thinking. Which brings me to your book, America Second. In a nutshell, what would you say it's about?
It's about links between the United States and the Communist Party. And it's important to emphasize that the Communist Party isn't China. And, fanhua and fandang, being against the Chinese people and being against the Communist Party are very different concepts. And that one can and should separate those in conversations. And I got interested in the subject by wondering where ideas of China came from in the United States. And then, very luckily, there grew to be all this focus on links between US businesses and Chinese businesses. And so a lot of the book talks about that very explicitly. And a lot of the work that Strategy Risks does now is in quantifying that exposure and due diligence and business intelligence that looks at links between individuals, companies, and entities.
And you're kind of like, correct me if this is an incorrect description, but almost like the anti-Henry Kissinger in some ways. And you mentioned you go through his particular, the role that the archetypal role that he's designed for himself, and in which so many others have followed. Right? What's wrong with what he has done since leaving public office?
Henry Kissinger, since 1982, and he's passed away about a year ago now, but from 1982 until he passed, he was a businessman masquerading as a diplomat. And my problem with what he did was the deception. It was not, hey, I run a consulting company and companies pay me hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars to introduce them to Chinese leaders and to advocate for them in front of Chinese leaders. It was, I'm a grand realist and everything I'm doing, is part of some massive strategic game. And the issue with that is, it's the deception. It's the pretending that you're doing something for one reason and really doing it to benefit Kissinger, as opposed to the United States or China or the U.S.-China relationship. And so my problem with him wasn't for what he did when he was in office, though that there are certainly issues with his policies there, especially outside of China and Cambodia and Pakistan. But my problem is what he did with the U.S.-China relationship and his strengthening of the Communist Party and strengthening the Communist Party's interests in the United States, and only very recently getting called into account for it.
Yeah. Isn't it, in essence, uh, influence peddling, which goes on in the still not drained DC swamp, um, and goes on in Canberra and elsewhere, but just extended to the whole of China, in
Yes.
the sense that, and so it comes naturally to many of those people that have been playing the games, and they sort of see nothing wrong with it, or at least they don't seem to be, tortured souls who stay up at night wondering whether they're doing the right thing.
So I run a business. We do consulting. We do work that's in that space. Because I run a business, it changes the way that I think and talk about things. And I
Mm,
try not to pretend to be an impartial arbiter
mm,
because I'm not. And I think one can make the case that even folks in universities or journalists and a lot of the intellectual backlash and a lot of the rights movements in the States over the past decade or so have been about identity and lack of objectivity.
mm,
And I think the problem with a lot of the formers is that they pretend that they're able to separate their consulting work from their public pronouncements. And they
mm,
can't because they're humans and no one can. And there's no way of doing it. And you go from this position where you're in government and everything is so heavily regulated and you have to be so clean, to a position where, besides some restrictions on lobbying or selling to former colleagues, you're just allowed to do anything you want, basically, within the law of citizens as opposed to within the law of government. And the other thing is that so many government officials get seduced by the attention and the private planes and the motorcades. And Beijing and some Middle Eastern countries do this quite well also, but Beijing excelled at treating formers like currents. So you'd be a former Secretary of State and you'd go to Beijing and you'd be treated like you were still in power. And that is
mm.
very, very validating for people. And it makes it very hard to turn down some of the things that Beijing dangled in front of them.
Yeah, and so how should people approach it, both in consulting gigs and more generally? The chambers of commerce folk, they have interest selling to China, and look. My approach is with these things is China's not going away. It's a commercial market. It's impossible to avoid conflicts entirely in this world. There'll always be, areas where you you're working for a client or doing different things, but be transparent, and to the extent possible, and explain where you're coming from. Then people can assess that, and your perspective on those merits. So, but don't give me the line, like the Chamber of Commerce stuff, that, oh, we're just doing out of our sweethearts selling this, that, and the other, and we're just interested in cracking down on people who are critical of China because we are a better place to manage the relationship. And if you don't toe the line, then you're not only uninformed, but sort of a on the wrong side of history, bad person, yada yada yada, right?
I think that's very well said. And Beijing loves to keep the relationship between high-level Chinese men and high-level, American or Australian or German men who they think are the ones that can manage the relationship. And then you get folks like Kissinger who think to themselves, only I am brilliant enough to manage something as complex as the US relationship with China. And they may or may not realize that they've been suckered in. From a business perspective, our point to our clients and the companies we talk to has always been just better price the risk. And so it's
Mm,
not don't invest in China. It's there's an increased risk of a Chinese invasion of Taiwan. There's increased sanctions risk. There's also very rarely the risk that the Communist Party entity that you're partnering with is going to be more trouble than it's worth, not even from the US side, but from the Chinese side. There's not fully this sense, even among people who spend a lot of time in China, how much the party consumes its own, and
mm.
really understanding that, hey, I have this board member whose uncle is a Politburo member, so I am safe, is not the defense that it once was. And frankly, was never really the full defense, because Politburo members and their families fall or get reined in quite oftenly.
Yeah. I'll talk about a few other things, but here's the book, so because it's always worth sort of keep plugging the book. But to give people a better sense of it, and the reason why I appreciated it is because it sort of contains some old school muckraking journalism. I mean, you really do name names and salacious details to a certain extent, and you go through former presidents and their U.S. presidents and their friends. Who was, maybe just give a sense of who's in the book and who maybe surprised you the most about their dealings with China that isn't as well known.
Madeleine Albright, the icon of democracy and former Secretary of State, was very disappointing to me in terms of how much she worked with China after leaving office. Neil Bush, brother of one president and son of another, is heavily exposed to the Communist Party in ways that were stunning to me, even a grizzled old former journalist like myself.
Really?
And I'm glad that I did write and publish the book. I finished writing the book before I started the company. And, so the book came out while I was running this business, but had I written the book later and had I edited the book in the line of the business, I feel like I would have been softer. And so, on the one hand, on the other hand, I'm glad that it worked out that way. It is so funny. You get in these new environments and suddenly it just changes your calculus about what you speak publicly on and what you don't. And so I talk a lot about self-censorship in the book, and I always try to be very explicit that I self-censor as well. And frankly, I don't know anyone who's not a complete pain to deal with who doesn't self-censor at least a little bit. But I think from a corporate perspective and from an ideas perspective, some of it is polite conversation, and that's a reason for self-censoring. But I was always suspicious of the argument, hey, I don't self-censor, I'm just trying to be polite. Well, that's yourself. Like, if you're not criticizing Beijing for concentration camps because you're trying to be polite, okay, you're making a decision, but that's also included in self-censorship.
And it's the story selection as well as the censorship too. It's what you focus on and those individuals that you imbue with, an heroic narrative, and those that are the villains in the story. And watching Chinese TV in China, there are lots of informative documentaries and news. And you get a sense of what's going on. But the important question is always what they're not talking about, right? And that goes on in the West as well to a certain extent. And there's journalists who don't, completely outside of China, don't talk about particular things because it's not in their interest to do so. So it's a tough game, the old journalism game, right? It's a tough game. You, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you did, when you were very young, did an exchange or spent some time in Xinjiang. Is that right?
I did. My first trip to China in 2001, I spent a summer with a group of high school students driving across Xinjiang, which was fascinating. And I had no context or sense of it. It was more just, I grew up in a small city in upstate New York, and I wanted to get as far away as possible. And this Western China seemed about as far away as I could get, spin the globe and go out on the other side. So I'm glad I got to see it then. I went back in 2006. I haven't been back since then, but it's so horrific that is happening in China today. And part of my frustration and part of the reason that I wrote the book was because of the cone of silence that I felt many in the American community had around what was happening in Xinjiang. Either they didn't want to believe it, or they just didn't want to offend Beijing, or they had business dealings there that they didn't want to jeopardize. And so I've been heartened to see US and Australian politicians and European politicians, but also business leaders, be more explicit on that. Let me take out business leaders. Business leaders haven't really spoken out about Xinjiang, but politicians and journalists and intellectuals have, and that's been very heartening.
What's the situation now? Because that issue's been bubbling along for a while, and there have been a more prominent focus globally about it. Is your sense that it's improved? If the situation's deteriorated, where are we now?
I don't know, and I wish I could say. I think my worry is that once the history does come out, it will prove to be worse than we thought, because I don't know of a case of an atrocity where once we were able to get in and report and uncover, once the archives came out, where it turned out to be more mild than we had expected. So my guess is that there are a lot more atrocities happening that we just don't know about. But yeah, I'm really not sure, and I wish I could point to very concrete information and documents on it. There's a lot of wonderful reporters who are piecing things together, but
Mm.
I'm not sure.
But there haven't been Western journalists that have been allowed in Xinjiang to poke around and ask any sort of questions outside of a supervised sort of visit, right? Waiban visit, yeah.
People have poked around, but it's really tip of the iceberg.
Mm. Just to push back a little bit, I mean, what should Beijing have done in that area? Because there were terrorist attacks in the people died in a shopping center, and there was fear amongst the Han population. And there have been, I guess, if we're honest, there have been e- ethnic disputes with the Muslim population in other parts of Asia. Should what Beijing's been doing be seen in that light, or is it something else entirely?
So I'll answer your question directly, but first with a caveat that I'm always wary of answering the should, because what should Beijing do?
Mm.
Dismantle the Communist Party, open up for elections, open the jails. And so, there's things like that, take Mao's photo, picture down from Tiananmen Square, apologize for the tens of millions of people who died. So,
Yeah.
but that's, I can spin all that, for weeks and won't get
Mm.
anywhere on that. And I do feel like one common thread is silly government overreaction to terrorism, which we've seen globally. The fact that folks in the United States still take their shoes off at airports because someone tried to put a bomb in their shoe, 20 plus years ago, and you can bring a gun onto a train, but you can't bring peanut butter onto an airplane. And so at some point, there will be a terrorist attack against a non-plane, and then all the regulations will rush to deal with that. And it's
Mm.
very much fighting the last war kind
Mm.
of mentality. But I think, Beijing, if we keep it with the Leninist model and what Beijing might have reasonably done instead, I think it would be of trying to allow for the creation of a Uyghur identity that didn't threaten the party, as opposed to making the Uyghur identity itself an enemy of the party. And creating, the party's given some lip service to sort of like, autonomous regions, one country, two systems. And I think allowing for more tolerance, and recognizing that people's fear is not something that needs to animate policymaking would have been a better response.
Yeah, yeah. It's there's so few Western journalists still allowed in China. It's hard to get firsthand reporting from there, and also there's restrictions on investigators doing work in China too, right? So it's very, very hard. We have had, in the same way that you detail in America Second, former politicians who have then gone on to get consulting gigs with Chinese companies. Famously, probably the most, well, there's been a stack of them. The former ambassador to China, Jeff Raby, still spouts the pro-Beijing line. The former foreign minister of China went to work for Huawei after leaving office. But some of them then say, well, that was then, and I wasn't to know that Xi Jinping would come along and change things so dramatically. So everything was cruising along as we expected. Trade liberalization will lead to democracy, blah, blah, blah. And, oh, Xi Jinping, what were we to do? And then after and now they've changed their tune. Do you buy into the idea that Xi Jinping can be used as an excuse for the way people acted previously?
I think it's so hard for someone in this position to get up and say, I did this, I was wrong, I shouldn't have done it. And I didn't include this in my book, but there was and I'm blanking on his name. I think he was a senator or congressman from Louisiana who had voted against. He was the one vote against condemning China or supporting Taiwan. It was a very significant vote in the 90s. I'm forgetting exactly the details. But then, I talked to him. He said he didn't fully say, hey, I was wrong, but he said, I strongly condemn what Beijing is doing with Xinjiang and with the camps, and my views have changed since then. And I would like to see more of the, hey, I thought this, and now I was wrong. And I'm far less significant than the people that you mentioned, but there's plenty of things that I've written in the past about China, about other things where I was just wrong about. And I wrote a piece for Newsweek 15 years ago where I talked about Beijing being good for Tibet, and that's what I believed at the time. And then I learned more and realized that I was wrong about it. So I think we're now facing the same thing where I believe that the US and China are far closer to war, and that the likelihood of a hot war breaking out between the US and China is much higher than people think. And when it does happen, people will say, I didn't notice this, I wasn't aware, as opposed to seeing all of the very clear signs. And, Dan, you and I might chat 5 years from now, and the world could look remarkably peaceful.
Oh,
And then I would have to say, you know what, I was wrong. But I feel pretty strongly that the way the odds are and the way the world is working and the direction that things are moving in, that is becoming more likely than not.
really? I'll come back to that. I mean, just on the point of people change their mind. Yeah, I do find these ex-politicians, because they've always been sort of looked to as the sort of Delphic oracle or something, they really struggle with it. But I will say this, there has been a change in Washington on a bipartisan basis when it comes to trade and the trading relationship with China over the last four years. Quite a dramatic one, really, when you think about it. I mean, I remember back in 2000 in Shanghai, and the attitude that existed then with China's accession to the WTO, and the politicians and the stuff that they spouted about how if we trade with China, democracy will come and all the rest of it. But now that's not the way people talk as much, at least in DC. Australia hasn't changed its trading relationship with China. It still wants to go back to the sort of, let's call it the pre-Trump world. So, that's not going to change, I think, in Washington, isn't it? I can't see any sign that people will be dropping tariffs on China in the near future. People realize that. Yeah.
I think it's very unlikely. I think the one scenario I can see is if there's such a drive towards climate change and such a belief in this idea that only by partnering with China can we solve climate change, which I believe is a mistake. I think if folks really wanted to solve climate change, being tougher on Beijing is a better strategy than partnering with Beijing. But I think there's a possibility that a Harris administration, especially a Harris administration that is very, very pro-Israel and feels the need to really amplify concerns about climate change, is softer on Beijing as a result, or a real move towards isolationism in the Republican Party and a focus on the Middle East and a relinquishing of troop presence in Asia and a successful Chinese seizing of Taiwan, in hours or days, where the US just stands aside and somehow lets it happen. And I think that's a very unlikely scenario, but that's another possible scenario where I think economic relations with China could improve after the shock wears off.
Right. So with this conflict with China that you think is likely, where's that going to happen, or where is that likely to play out? Taiwan?
Knowing the macro and then figuring out which micro will spur the macro, the latter is much more difficult. So I can think of dozens, hundreds of scenarios that could spur that, but getting right on which one does is so much more challenging. So China is annexing, or if you prefer a stronger word, invading Bhutan and it's unlikely that India will move troops into Bhutan to defend Bhutan, and that'll spark a war. But it's possible. I'd put that very low percentage. Or the disputed territory between China and India and Arunachal Pradesh, or enough
Where
Chinese.
where there has been conflict, right? There actually literally has.
Yes, yeah, and there have been, depending on your definition of war, China and India fought either border skirmishes or border wars. China and Russia could still go to war. That's not impossible. China, Vietnam, China and Japan. Something could happen with Mongolia. Something could happen with Afghanistan. And so all of these, I would say, are less likely than a conflict or a war over Taiwan or over the Philippines. But if you add up the percentages of all of those together, then perhaps that's more than the possibility of Taiwan. So there's a lot of these different scenarios that could happen. And I don't have China and Lithuania going to war on my bingo card, but there's a world where that does.
There are a lot of bingo cards that have come up of late, over the last couple of years, that people didn't quite expect. Yeah, I think that people focus a lot on Taiwan, but like you said, there's a lot of other potential flashpoints, which I don't know. That India-China one is one that I think you never know, because they do have a real clash over water and strategy and economics, and they don't. And obviously the South China Sea too. Who knows? There could be a flashpoint. There could be a. I was chatting with John Lee, who I'm not sure if you know. He's an advisor now to the Defense Department, the other day, and he's originally from Malaysia. And we were just saying that in 1997 there were effectively pogroms in Indonesia against the Chinese there, and there was great unhappiness in Beijing about that. But they couldn't do anything about it because they didn't have the power to do so. Well, now they probably could do something if they saw that they're, the overseas Chinese, over which they have always a sort of paternal interest, they were threatened, or there were things on TikTok coming back to mainland China. There would be dramatic. There would be a perceived need to act there. So yeah, no, it's you never know how it turns out. Speaking of TikTok, we in China circles, there's always the 3 T's, right? That you can't talk about: Tiananmen, Taiwan, and Tibet. But there are other T's out there at the moment in the China game. So let's go through some of those. TikTok, you mentioned earlier, is incredible. I mean, I actually met the designated head of TikTok Australia in 2019 in Shanghai when I was up there for a trip, and it was still. It was a dot on the horizon. No one really knew that it would take off like it did. What's your view on TikTok? I mean, you go into great detail on Grindr, something that I'm not as familiar with, but poses incredible risks, really, when you think about it. But TikTok, where do you sit? Should it be banned? I mean, should it be?
I remember Rupert Murdoch becoming a U.S. citizen in order to buy U.S. media properties. And there's a strong national security thread in most large countries of the world over propaganda, domestic communication, broadcasting, that the laws around social media haven't caught up with. And so I think the problem with the debate around TikTok was that it's seen as this is, anti-American, and it's seen as if free speech is entirely divorced with national security concerns. And one could say that the US shouldn't legislate and that the FCC or other bodies shouldn't be as involved in communications as they have been over the decades and centuries, but they have been. And it's somehow that the TikTok debate fell into a different square. So I feel like the way that the US government should have handled TikTok is through that lens and done that much earlier. I also find it fascinating and unsurprising how gentle both political parties have been on TikTok, where they'll criticize it and use it at the same time. And I do feel like had one party made itself the party of banning TikTok, they would have felt that in the polls. And it's not necessarily because there's any sort of undue influence from Beijing, but it's just Beijing has now created a platform, or rather Chinese entrepreneurs separate from Beijing have created a platform that Beijing can now utilize if it so chooses. And the other thing about TikTok is it really does point to the difficult space that some brilliant Chinese entrepreneurs are in, where they're too critical for Beijing and they're too pro-China for America. And it's a very tough space to be in. And I believe that the founder of TikTok did not want to create a tool that could change the hearts and minds of America and be part of the influence operations that Beijing is doing. He just wanted to build a successful tech product and make a lot of money. But that's not something that you can do in China today. The reality does not allow for that. And so Chinese entrepreneurs are so squeezed by the Communist Party, and they're so much more afraid, with good reason, of the Communist Party than they are anything the US or Australian governments can do.
Yeah, I mean, the Australian government's banned TikTok for use in Parliament House, but it's so popular amongst large swathes of the population that, yeah, likewise, I just think I can't get my head around that. I don't think they could be politically popular to ban. And yet there's that potential there for either subtly or directly influencing the population if you wanted to at a later stage. And what do you do?
Yeah, I mean, so India banned it, and that was seemingly quite successful. But I mean, I think what you do is you announce it very, very early, you implement it very, very quickly, and then you hope your party recovers by the midterms.
Yeah. Speaking of entrepreneurs, Elon Musk has opened up a factory in Shanghai, a Tesla factory, right? So, and I think, anyone who buys a Tesla in Australia probably would likely get it from that factory rather than one in the US, just because of the transportation costs and what have. So why is that a good thing, or is that a bad thing, or what risk does that pose to Elon, given his increasingly prominent role in the world and also in US politics at the moment?
It's astounding that Elon runs a media company, a weapons company, and a company with heavy China exposure, and he somehow has managed to pull it off. And I think and I worry about this if Trump wins, but the idea of SpaceX being a very important part of the US defense establishment doesn't account for Musk's exposure to China. And a lot of other major US defense primes also have very high China exposure, and certainly higher than SpaceX. But when one looks at companies, one has to look at their ownership as well. And you can't just pretend, oh, their supply chains are clean, or their business fundamentals are clean. You have to look at it more holistically. I still find his moves head spinning, and it's not an original thought there, but just his balancing act is astounding. So
I just can't get over how running a business, even a smaller business, is all consuming, and how you run multiple businesses in multiple, highly innovative and different sectors, and seem to pull it off in many ways. It boggles my mind how he does it. But yeah, and look, he does seem to. So all these business people, including in China, there is a global tech culture in a sense. You meet Chinese entrepreneurs, and they're not that dissimilar to their American counterparts. They're they're like their lava lamps and their goofy kind of memes, and they're not sitting around, I think, as some people in the West might think, in China, working out how can we hack the Americans. I mean, that's they might do that, and they might be told to do that in due course, or they might do it for giggles, or they might genuinely have some sort of vendetta. But it's not all of them, and the same is true in the States. And there are good and bad actors. But yeah, you just have to. I just with Elon Musk, and in the same way, in Chinese tech entrepreneurs have tripped over or found themselves on the wrong sides of the political tides. That is a risk for him too, I think. Whether in China or the US or elsewhere, it's just it's a dangerous game. So what you haven't been back to China since when?
2019, and that will be my last trip for a while. And it's
Mm,
not because I don't miss the place. It's not because
mm,
there's not a lot of incredible people there. It's
mm,
just I feel like the risk is too high, and
mm.
I discourage other folks from going, especially folks who can't be away from their cell phones or laptops. But that point aside, I do feel like the risks of getting seized or harassed or tortured are higher than people think, especially for Chinese people, Chinese Americans. And I think what too often happens is people will say, well, I'm going back, so I'm not going to post anything about China on social media for a couple of weeks. And okay, fine, we all make sacrifices, but I don't think people understand that from a freedom of speech perspective and from a oh, you're in a prominent think tank or you're a prominent journalist and you just being quiet in the face of Beijing isn't something that you should be doing. And a lot of the media outlets that are still there make sacrifices in order to be there. And that's just always been part and parcel of being in the media business. Like you have to do that when you're in a totalitarian regime. But I think they need to be more transparent about the sacrifices they're making so that they can make better decisions about at what point do you pull out.
Yeah, but I just tell people, my uncle and I are heading there on a tourist trip. If you're doing that and you haven't, you're not saying and have never said critical things of Beijing in China circles, or you don't have a you're not a politically exposed person in any way, you that's probably going to be fine. Very, very, very low risk. But if you've got any sort of complicated business dealings, or you've involved in any sort of commercial dispute there, or you are someone who you are a political person, then there's a risk at some level that something could happen if tensions boil over, or you become embroiled in the controversy du jour, and things can spin out of control. But yeah, but do you have friends? Because there's been a big clean out of people that I've known have worked as lawyers and journalists in China over the last 10 years. And it's sort of amazing in many ways. I mean, so many of the international law firms have shut down. At one stage, there were no Australian journalists. I think they've allowed the ABC to go back, this Australian Broadcasting Corporation to go back. But apart from that, they were filing stories from like Korea and Taiwan and other places. So you've seen the same phenomenon from people that you know?
The vast majority of my friends have left, both
Mm.
Chinese and otherwise. And for most of them, I don't think they regret it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. So maybe try to give us an optimistic note, or at least a strategy for going forward for people who in Australia and elsewhere that might be listening to this. What can they do to protect themselves against China risk, or better deal with necessary engagement with involvement with China?
So for global businesses in Australia and elsewhere, but say specifically in Australia, doing very concrete due diligence and understanding who you're partnering with is so incredibly important. You can get that information. You just have to get it outside of China, but know your customers, know your partners. The other thing is make sure you take care of your Chinese staff. And sometimes that means you have to keep them out of certain conversations, not because they're not wonderful and brilliant, but because doing so gets them in trouble. And so be very careful with information that you're sharing with them. And gosh, I'm trying to think how to end on an optimistic note. There's a lot of really, really just quite brilliant, talented, artistic Chinese who are now finding their voice and expression outside of China. And in a way, that's great for the rest of the world, because there is a real brain drain and allowing for the flourishing of exiled Chinese communities in Sydney and Tokyo and New York. And so encourage folks to go and check those out, and to spend time with the Chinese people who have left and to hear their stories.
Yeah, that's always the most positive and interesting thing. Actually, there's one other question that I think is important and forgot to ask. Are China's actions today motivated more by realist great power thinking or ideology? Because my views probably changed a bit on that over the years.
I think they're motivated more by neither, with the healthy caveat that I don't have any idea what Xi Jinping is thinking. My
Yeah.
guess is that his views are motivated by what keeps him in power.
Mm,
And the lens through which he sees those views is Marxist Leninism, or sort of a like 1920s, 1930s view of communism, kind of pre-Stalin.
mm,
I don't see it as coming from pragmatism or a sort of a broad Chinese lens. I think he considers himself quite Marxist, and I think he's less a student of Chinese history than Mao was. But
mm,
it's a fun parlor game to guess what he's thinking and how it
mm.
animates his belief.
But,
And
but would China be different under a different, like under Chiang Kai-shek? If it would be probably still pretty authoritarian in some ways to rule such a large country, although probably better. But would it not, you know, press its interest as a great power in a somewhat similar way, albeit different to
so
China?
many accidents of history. I mean,
Mm,
I think Chiang Kai-shek, having a son who took over and then
mm,
reformed, and Mao having his son die in the Korean War, and so that
mm,
there couldn't be this communist dictatorship like
mm,
North Korea, or perhaps Mao's son would have been a reformer, or perhaps he would have fallen to Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping, and would have happened
mm,
that way. So I do think China would have been quite different had Li
mm.
Keqiang or someone else won, but it just has to remain a fascinating counterfactual
Yeah.
because
It's big. Well, look, mate, really appreciate the time to talk. I think I said before we got on, I've always found it relaxing people who are legitimate China, talking to guys, people who are legitimate China guys, because you don't have to explain stuff to them as you do have to explain to many people. It's who don't have that same experience. It's like having gone to school with someone. You know the same people. You know who the bad teachers were and how the bad food was, and you recognize similar classmates in different years. So appreciate your time, and we'll chat further, no doubt, as things develop, both in the years going forward.
I
Really
look forward
appreciate
to
it.
that. Thanks for taking the
Thanks, mate.
time. It's great to chat and look forward to seeing the podcast.
See you. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.